All right, welcome everybody to the Sound Off Show. Something special this week. We've got David Phillips from NLogic who's going to be joining us today. And David, thank you very much for being a supporter of the Sound Off podcast.
It's a pleasure. We love it.
Do you? What turned you on to it? Because you were an early supporter. You got me like in the first couple weeks that I started doing this thing.
So we have an account executive out in our Vancouver office called Jack Cales, who is a radio obsessive. And we were on a market trip we were driving into Edmonton, and he mentioned this podcast that you were doing. And so I gave it a try, and I loved it. And what I liked about it is it made me realize how unimportant we are. Because it made me realize just how much other stuff people in radio have to think about and have to have on their plate. So I love how inside it is, and you get some good people on there.
And I think when you came on the podcast and you were talking about competition, it's really what, podcast is all about. You have to compete against the mountains, and you have to compete against the stuff people have to do in life, and really the way people can, consume their audio. Has that changed for you in the last couple of years and how you look at it?
No, not at all. I think that's still relevant, and I think that I don't have any much better answers. I mean, other than smarter people than I have already, said and realized is that given that your competition is everywhere, you have to make finding you as easy as possible. And it's been interesting watching the last 2 years, around podcasts, but also around radio, the strides that people are making, with whenever I listen to to Kiss 92, they always talk about, hey, Alexa, listen to, that the fact that people are, both in radio and in podcasting, obviously working hard and looking hard and making strides at discoverability and access. Because if your competition is everything, then the last thing you want to do is put a barrier between you and someone trying to access you. So it still remains true. But we've definitely seen strides in the last couple of years of people looking to reduce the barriers to getting people onto it.
Have you given any thought to podcast and podcast metrics? Have you looked into to see what it's all about, and what do you think about it?
Not corporately, to be honest. I mean, I think, well, yes and no. We think a lot about broadcast and where that's going. So that sort of podcast, well, it is podcast, but it's also streaming. And, it's been great to see people experimenting and rolling out different ads in radio streams, and the ability to add in what's called dynamic ad insertion, to do different ads in different people's streams. We think about that quite a lot. We think about, okay, what do we do in that world where more of that is commonplace that's valuable? We think about that for radio and also for TV, about in a world where less is broadcast and more is streamed. What does that mean? Podcasting right now, I think we don't have an active kind of plan to get in there right now, but we're definitely looking at the non-linear space and non-sort of traditional space and seeing what we can do. We've got some plans in that space, but nothing concrete as yet.
Well, you touched on something that we do around here, on the Sound Off podcast, and that's the dynamic ad insertion. And for those who don't know, NLogic being a supporter of the podcast, your ads are played on all the Canadian downloads, but if you go down to the U.S., like let's say you were to travel to Buffalo, you wouldn't get the NLogic ads anymore.
Right.
You get an American one in there, and I think with having you guys, it sort of solved a bit of a problem. I mean, listen, we have this, I think there's companies like Blue Apron that have nothing to do with Canada. I don't even think they sell in Canada, yet it's appearing on all the podcasts. So that's I guess that's a challenge and something that needs to be solved for the podcast industry.
Yeah, it's one of the things that in general I think podcasting is, I don't want to say it's sort of kidding itself on, but I think it must be a challenge that I'm sure comes up at the conferences that I see you go to, which is, a lot of the appeal of the ads on podcasting are that they're essentially, they're reach, they're sort of organic, and they're presenter produced, and which is why they're really appealing, because they're sort of integral content to the rest of the podcast, in the same voices and the same style and that kind of stuff. And that's most of the ads on most of the podcasts I listen to. And the trouble is, okay, how do you scale that? Both sort of in terms of numerically and if you have lots of podcasts. And it's interesting watching larger or growing companies like Gimlet trying to solve it in different ways. And You're seeing companies trying to network effect, trying to create networks essentially across that. And it's going to be interesting from a listener point of view as much as anything else, that what's going to happen to podcast ads. So will people hit a point where you can't do those integrated ads anymore? Just like, TV started where everything was integrated, then it went to kind of the ads were produced separately and inserted, and now we're seeing almost a bit of a return back to more integration. Is that going to happen to podcasting? As it gets bigger, you're going to end up with more traditional looking kind of treatment of ads, and what's that going to do to podcasting? I don't think it's going to do anything that dramatic, but it's fascinating how old things become new things, become old things. Facebook does a mid-roll ad right now. So, yeah, I love being right now a sort of very interested consumer of podcasts and not necessarily trying to figure out all the measurement challenges right now.
What do you think some of the biggest challenges are facing radio broadcasters today, given everything that's going on, and it changes every 10 minutes?
It does, yeah. I don't think they're facing anything that, as far as I can tell, is particularly unique to radio. I think, I was thinking about this a little bit beforehand, and a challenge that radio has, which again is common to lots and lots of companies, including ours, is how do you transform for the future whilst running a great business day to day? And there have been times in radio, and there have been times in other industries where I don't want to say you've got money floating around, but like access to capital expenditure money and that kind of stuff was easier to come by. And it is challenging both from a sort of cultural point of view and a hiring point of view, and as well as a financial point of view, to do those two things at the same time. How do you create what's coming next, and also run what's now, and do so in a world where you have to justify your dollars? So that's tricky, but not unique to radio. The other thing is talent, and it's something that I used to hear about all the time, and not dismissed, but sort of it never seemed to be as important as people said. But the longer I run a company, the longer I run and observe other companies, all the cliches are cliches because they're true, that if you don't have the right talent, you're not going to be able to get much done. And so how does radio attract and retain the best talent, not just on air, but also in the business? And then the last thing I guess to think of is, and this is a media-specific thing that radio, I think, has to, and is wrapping its head around, is how do clients understand the value of what radio does? I've talked for ages about this thing that we talk about a lot, which is that the core product is so great, it works so well. How it talks about itself and how it goes to the advertisers, I think, needs to be updated. So those are the things that I think radio needs to be thinking about, most of which are sort of common to lots of other companies, but that doesn't make it necessarily much easier.
What if you're on the other side of it and an advertiser? What are you looking ahead for the next year if you're in an advertising state of mind?
I think if I was most advertisers, I'd be fairly stressed. I think it's kind of like, you look at the world of retail in particular, and like, how on earth do you figure out what to do? And I'm funny enough, I'm about to do a presentation next week talking about, I call it slides versus seesaws. We tend to think that there's a movement from one thing to another, and that movement is inevitable. And typically, we're not actually dealing with the slide, we're dealing with a seesaw, which is trying to strike a balance. And I think what would be challenging from my point of view as an advertiser is how do you strike the appropriate balance? And that's things like, even 3 years ago, it seemed, the accepted wisdom that everyone should end up being purely just online. So you had companies like Warby Parker, online-only optician, and Indochino, and of course Amazon. We go, okay, the future is that we're all digital. And now you see, okay, Warby Parker is opening up like 50 stores, and Amazon opened up physical stores, and you kind of go, okay. And at the same time, Walmart's investing tons of money in companies like Jet, which is, online. So it's, how do you as an advertiser not go to one extreme or the other? How do you not overreact and, jeopardize your business by overreacting to going to one extreme? And also not be too late. So I think when it comes to marketing, how that manifests itself is how do you balance the short and the long term? How do you balance investing in your brand with things like radio and TV? And then also looking at the short-term performance stuff, things like search engine optimization and that kind of thing. So I think finding that balance, again, in an environment where everything is under heavy scrutiny, I think is something they need to think about and pay more attention to. And we're seeing evidence of that. We're seeing evidence of a sort of rebalancing away from extremes. But it's tricky.
What keeps you up at night?
Well, I've started doing karate, which is hilarious, and I'm easily the worst person in the class. And it's the most, anyone who knows me at least, even a tiny bit will know, it's one of the least likely things for me to do. So often soreness, to be honest, after being kicked by other people. I don't worry about a ton of stuff. I mean, I think the things that I think about most frequently are, again, fairly cliched, but like a really basic question that I think about most often probably is how do we consistently create things that our clients want, which is a really simple question, but not, it needs a lot of thought, it needs a lot of work, it needs a lot of effort. And, how do we do that? How do we help them do the things that I talked about at the start of this? How do we help them transform for the future whilst also making their day-to-day business run as well as they possibly can run it? The only thing I do worry about, which is sort of not strictly related to media, but is I'm a bit of a politics bore and a history bore. So how does the way the world's going with sort of decline of, for want of a better word, traditional media like newspapers, what does that do to our society when people are just seeing nonsense through Facebook all day? So I probably worry about that more than the other things. The other things we can work out, but that one I worry about a little bit more.
Where do you see radio in 5 years?
I think it's going to be pretty strong. I've been reading a lot about the situation in the UK recently, and I don't know if you've been looking at that, but commercial radio in particular is going through an absolute sort of, is flying right now in the UK. They've had, I think, 12% revenue increase or something massive. But not only that, they've got a lot of superstars. One guy in particular, a guy called Chris Evans, who was, I think he's doing the most listened to radio show on BBC, which is the most listened to radio show, I think, in the country. And he's recently come back to what is now a very small commercial radio station in the UK. There's a lot of buzz around radio. So I'm going to go, there's nothing that means that can't happen in Canada, that we can't get, not that, but we can't get a bit more of a renaissance, a bit more of a buzz around radio in Canada. I think you're going to see increased automation. We're seeing that, and we're sort of part of that with what we're doing. And I do think, we talked about podcasting a little earlier. I think you're going to see radio broadcast companies having increasingly diverse revenue streams. I think you're going to have, partly by necessity, but partly because there's opportunities out there right now to have your sort of traditional business, which is still going to be the majority of business and still going to be strong. But also you're going to see, money from unique content podcasting, like the kind of stuff that Chorus and Rogers have been doing recently is really interesting because it's not just repurposing old stuff, it's a new piece of business, it's new content, new people running it. I think you're going to see more and more of that, more diversity, which is, again, a fantastic thing, I think, for radio.
Well, you were just mentioning about the revenue side of things in the UK and how it's going up, and they've managed to do that by, supplanting a lot of it in digital.
Yeah.
But in North America, we've been very, very slow to turn the corner and do that. And, you've got your roots in Britain. Can you see why or how that's happened?
I think it's I don't know the details, but I think what's fascinating is that it's not just that they have digital, it's what digital's allowed them to do. So when I look at it and I go, okay, what digital's allowed them to do is talk about themselves differently, sell themselves differently, and experiment. So if we can't, in the Canadian industry, have the same technological underpinnings or technical underpinnings with DAB that there is in the UK, is there anything stopping us from doing those other three things? Is there anything stopping us from talking about ourselves differently, selling ourselves differently, and experimenting more? And I don't think there is. There's no intrinsic reasons why we can't do that. They've done a really good job of marketing themselves. I think the work that Radio Connect here is doing is really good. I think the work that Radio Centre is doing in the UK is also very good. But I don't see anything that's materially that different. The technology is helpful, and you would know more about why that hasn't happened in Canada. But I don't think we should look at that as an excuse. I think we should go, okay, what's that enabled them to do that's led to this success, and what can we do in our way to replicate that?
NLogic, it's I mean, we look at it as a tech company. And one of the things tech companies have gotten really, really good at in the last 10 years is pairing up and getting people closer together. And I talk about it every week when I'm, when we're talking about your ads, we're connecting buyers and sellers. So what are you guys working on at NLogic to bring the buyers and sellers closer together?
Oh, a lot. I mean, I think it's been, I remember I was listening to the ads a little while ago, and I said at one point, it's what I'm most proud of, and it remains the thing I'm most proud of. I think, we've seen over the last year just growing adoption of people using it to connect together more seamlessly, and we've put dozens of new things in there in the last few months, dozens of improvements, and I know what's coming up, which is great too. There's a few things we've done behind the scenes as well, so we've connected with Salesforce at a company and things like that. And I think anything that we can do, we talked a little while ago in this conversation about reducing the barriers to get people onto stuff. That's what we see as our mission for Lens for Radio. How do we make it easier for people to express the value of radio and trade? And we can see one of the great things about having technology at the heart of what we do is we can see how people use the tool, and we can see every day people are using it more and more in a more efficient way, which is fantastic. So we're going to continue doing that. We've investing, actually. One of the reasons we've moved to this new office is we're hiring more engineers and more product people, because we've got more plans to do bigger and better things. So that's really exciting, and I'm looking forward to seeing what we're going to get done in the next year or so.
Can you give me a little insight over what those things might be? Because you hire these people and you bring them in, and it's like, but you hire them with a purpose. Because I mean, what's something that you want to do that you just can't do this year that you'd love to do in 5 years?
I think that that's a really good question. I should ask myself repeatedly. There's one thing we'd love, one area we're really interested in right now for both TV, and we're starting with TV and also with radio, is how do we recreate some of the kind of emotional things that Facebook and Google provide to advertisers? And let me explain a little bit what I mean by that. So if you sign up, and you do this, I'm sure, as you spend on these places, you can log into to Facebook or Google once you have a campaign there and see how your campaign's doing. It gives you a nice, pretty little graph. It tells you how many people you've reached. You have a certain level of control about what you can do with that campaign. But it makes you feel involved in it because you're in there. You log into the platform, you see what's happening, you see how many people saw it. I think one of the things that part of the reboot that radio needs to do is to provide some sort of that comfort, some sort of the similar sort of, okay, I know what happened. And so, again, we're working on a product on TV, which we think could also work in radio, which basically begins to scratch some of that itch, begins to go, someone could log in and say, okay, here's what happened yesterday. And that requires a lot of thinking and some products. We hired our first ever, what's called a product designer. So how does the thing look? How does the thing work? How do we make it really appealing for people? As appealing as when they go into Facebook or Google, or frankly, as appealing as when they go into their investment app or their Fitbit app. That's the new normal. If you buy Fitbit, you can log in and see your progress. If you buy an ad on Spotify, you can see your progress. So that should be normal for radio. And that's what one of the things we're looking at this year.
Yeah, that'd be third-party tracking, right?
Well, possibly. It's just a way of kind of, what we get really into, what I get rambly about is means not ends. So if what we're actually trying to achieve isn't necessarily a number, but it's a feeling of security. When you go to a restaurant and you order a meal and the waiter goes off and a bad waiter doesn't come back, and you're left with that slight sense of anxiety of so did they take my order? Has the kitchen got it? Are they working on it? A good waiter comes back and checks in, especially if it's been a while, and says, don't worry, the kitchen's working on it, be there in 5 minutes. And so what that does, yes, it's data, but it's actually a reassurance. It's actually a comfort level. And I think right now, too often with radio and TV, a campaign is bought by an advertiser, and it's a bit like the waiter goes off. You're not quite sure what's happening. Now, you may know at the end, but you won't know in the meantime. So what we're interested in is what can we do for TV and radio that basically gives that sense of reassurance that, okay, this is working, something's happening, keep going. That may be data, that may not be, but I think it's what we're trying to get at is that kind of involvement and that sense of comfort. And we've got some plans, and we'll see what happens.
David, thanks a lot for being with us on the Sound Off show.
Pleasure.
I know you're on the phone and there's like me on a camera, but still, it's thank you very much for being.
You're on a camera?
Well, I've got a camera.
Are you pulling weird faces when I do? That would be good if you were. Were you pulling weird faces when I was saying things you think are nonsense?
No, I have to pay attention because people, take note of this stuff. Should it appear on YouTube or Facebook? I don't have the money quite yet for a set.
Right.
And
green screen it, man. Green screen it. You could so welcome to my beachfront, and it's
I know we need more people like you to buy ads on the podcast. And by the way, I love how the company is a supporter of podcasting. I know we've had James Cridland on, and he's got Pod News, and I know that's something that arrives in your box every day because your logo is in there, and I think that's great.
Yeah, James is great. We are very interested, and part of a lot of it, frankly, is glorified self-interest. Like, we need this industry to be great because then we can be great. If this industry dies, we'll die with it. Now, I know it's going to die, but I personally love what's come. Love looking at the future, and I love people, and I love being involved with people who are thinking about the future. It's why we're involved in your station, with your podcast. It's why we're involved with James's newsletter. I mean, he's a great guy. I love what you're doing with the podcast, and we're all for that kind of stuff.
Well, thanks a lot, David. I really appreciate you joining me here on this one today.
My pleasure.